Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jennifer Gibson. I'm the co-founder of SXSW, which is taking a new approach to whistleblowing and trying to build a collective movement within tech and government that enables people to speak out easier and more safely. Before we start today, we want to acknowledge, for those of you who looked at the agenda before today, there was supposed to be a third speaker here. Mark McGann, almost 3 years ago today, became front page news as the Uber Files whistleblower here in Europe. He was a former senior executive of Uber who disclosed over 124,000 documents to The Guardian and about 24 newspapers about detailing Uber's expansion into Europe, laws that were broken, and what was going on behind the veil of the corporate image. Mark was supposed to be here today, was very excited to be here with us today. You may also have heard that the Trump administration has recently gone after Harvard. So Mark is a senior fellow at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University right now, and on advice did not leave the US out of fear that he would not get back in on his visa because of what's going on. So it's perhaps an apt setting and segue into what we're here to talk about today. We are entering turbulent times is probably an accurate statement, certainly on the other side of the Atlantic, but I don't know, as someone who lives here, that things feel any more stable here. The guardrails on democracy are at best weakening, if not coming off the track altogether, and we're left in a situation where the insider is becoming more important than ever. What we know about what's going on in centers of power is coming from those on the inside. It's not coming through regulation, and no more so is that true than in tech, where the power that is accumulating in places like Silicon Valley is currently doing so at a rapid speed and without oversight by regulators or anyone else. And in those contexts, finding ways for people to speak out more safely and be able to share what's going on behind the veil becomes critical to society and stopping harms that might be committed. So on that note, I'm delighted to be moderating a panel here with two individuals who will talk a little bit later about whether they call themselves whistleblowers or insiders, but nonetheless have taken in their lives a very courageous step in speaking out when they saw wrongdoing. And so I'll start with Zelda. Zelda in 2017 became one of the first people to break her NDA to disclose Harvey Weinstein's misbehavior, maybe not the right word, but basically became one of the first people to speak out about what Harvey Weinstein had been doing. Her disclosures to the FT, The Guardian, The New York Times, and The New Yorker led to exposés that basically started the Me Too movement. Since then, after being called Time's Person of the Year, or one of Time's People of the Year in 2018, Zelda has gone on to campaign and set up Can't Buy My Silence, a campaigning organization determined to stop the use of NDAs for covering up wrongdoing. And one of the things that's always struck me about Zelda's story is, Zelda, you actually worked for Harvey Weinstein in the late 90s. So it was quite a while after you signed the NDA that you came forward. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that decision in 2017 to speak out.
Sure. So I was only 24 when I was coerced, or as I describe it, legally waterboarded into signing a settlement agreement that contained non-disclosure provisions which precluded me from speaking to the police, to a therapist, to my family, to the HMRC, to even holding a copy of my own settlement agreement. And obviously at 24, I'd never had any experience with big corporate law or lawyers or negotiations, and had thought that when I reported Weinstein sexually assaulting my younger colleague and reporting it to the law, the British legal system, I thought justice, naively, justice would be served. And I mean, I think what's interesting in your introduction is you say I broke my NDA to expose Harvey Weinstein's misconduct. In fact, for me, this journey was much more about exposing the system. the system that enables those in power to act with impunity. And that system is still very strong and in place, and in some countries right now is being made even stronger. At the time, I was immediately told by my own legal team that I basically had no access to justice because of the power disparity, because it was my word and my colleagues' word against Weinstein, against Miramax, against Disney, and that there was a very simple formula. We'd be given some money, we'd be given a good reference, everybody would be fine, and off we'd go. I wasn't told at that point that there would be silencing. And actually, the negotiations, which were terrifying, and we were made to feel, these two young women who were reporting a sexual predator, were made to feel like the criminals. At that time, we saw this agreement as our only tool to hold any form of accountability to Weinstein. And actually, he had, huge provisions in there that were meant to stop his behavior, which clearly they didn't, as we can now see. So moving forward to 2017, I had actually broken my confidentiality clauses many times. I left the country 8 months after I signed the agreement because it actually was impossible for me, one, to work, but it was impossible for me to live or exist because I had no voice. And you don't really understand what having your voice is, what that means until it's taken away. I couldn't explain to anybody anything. I wasn't even allowed to talk about my past career. So I moved to Central America, where I stayed for 5 years, had full facial reconstruction. I'm actually 95. I did try and break my NDA many times, but it was very clear that there was no interest or appetite for that because of the power structures that there were and still are and are growing. So in 2017, when I was approached by the New York Times, and I heard that the right people were speaking about Weinstein, and then when that initial story broke from the New York Times, so literally the day after the story in the New York Times, where I was named in this story, but I wasn't on the record source, so I hadn't officially broken my NDA. I had broken it, but I hadn't officially broken it. All I could see was everyone going after Weinstein, which was correct, but the problem wasn't really Weinstein. And I will keep on saying this until I'm blue in the face. The problem is the system. The problem is the integrity of law. The problem is these mechanisms that protect those in power. And it doesn't just have to be an Elon Musk or a Trump or a Weinstein or a Gaiman or whoever you want to go to. It's your manager at McDonald's. Anybody who is in a position of power over you and holds the keys to your purse has the ability to silence you if you're going to talk about something that they don't want out there. So for me, it was incredibly, incredibly important that the focus was taken to the mechanism and to the bigger picture. Harvey going to jail is correct, but Harvey going to jail has not stopped the behavior. It has not stopped lawyers, big corporates, small companies, individuals silencing victims of misconduct. And we're not just talking about sexual misconduct. We're talking about every form of harm. And for there to be a legal agreement that can hide harm is nonsensical on every level. The reality is that most NDAs aren't actually enforceable and wouldn't be enforceable in court. But this is a secret that people don't really believe. And to test that, you have to have money, balls, time, good legal representation, and the emotional desire. And most people, having gone through the process of negotiating a settlement with an NDA in, most of them say that actually that process was worse than the original misconduct or issue, and that's what breaks them. So we're losing a huge amount of the workforce, the people who have integrity, the people who stand up and speak for what's right, the people who are trying to improve companies from the inside by going and reporting inside. And then once they've reported, they get shut down, they get bullied, they get forced into a position of silence. And therefore, the cycle continues.
Yeah, as someone who works day in and day out with whistleblowers, and we were talking earlier, most of the people, Mark, for full disclosure, Mark is one of my clients. I was with Mark from the day he went public. But most of my clients I've worked with, most of the whistleblowers or insiders who I've helped get information out, remain anonymous out of fear of all of those things you were just saying, and almost always there's an NDA involved. And the question is, am I going to get sued for my NDA? And you can never give them an absolute, no, you're not going to get sued. And that is enough for most people to chill them from ever saying anything. It's a good segue and transition to you, Will. So, Will, you were inside of Microsoft for a number of years, working on responsible AI. You and a group of colleagues tried internally for years to raise with Microsoft the issue that in all of their public-facing materials, they were talking about sustainability, but behind the scenes, they were helping oil and gas build bespoke AI tools that extracted oil and gas at a much faster and greater rate than we'd ever seen. And after years of internally battling over the issue, you decided to leave. You've made the choice. You gave up a very, very good job in tech, made a decision on principle that you couldn't fight from the inside anymore. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what made you realize that working from the inside wasn't enough anymore, and what Will and a group of colleagues, worth noting, then went and did. They went and spoke to Karen Howe at The Atlantic, who wrote a piece in September called "The Hypocrisy of Microsoft," I believe was the title, Microsoft's Hypocrisy, something along those lines. We'll caveat that with, I'm not sure it's exactly the title. Also, full disclosure, I've worked with Will and some of those who spoke to Karen, and you were quite unique, again, in the fact that you were a collective who came forward. You actively coordinated around who was going to be publicly speaking, and this is one of the first times you've publicly spoken about your role. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit both about the decision that internal just wasn't enough, and what then made you take the leap to go further.
Gladly. I think my decision to come forward was driven by the realization that the AI tools that I was helping to build, intended to address climate change, were actually being weaponized by the worst actors to do the worst things. And so in 2020, when I joined, it was the year of Microsoft's broad and bold sustainability commitments, and optimism was very high. And I was on the AI platform, which powers things like ChatGPT, and I was really in a position for great impact. And I know you've all heard some version of the fact that AI is being hailed as essential to addressing climate change. And that might be partly true, but that's actually a mythology that's designed to distract you from the true harms of the technology. And I call it a mythology because I helped create that. I helped co-author Microsoft's white paper, Accelerating Sustainability with AI. And I watched that be used to pull attention away from the bigger harms. And when I say harms, I mean fossil fuel companies using AI in unprecedented ways to find and extract more oil. Think AI for fracking, think mapping the ocean subfloor, figuring out where and how to drill in ways that are unprecedented in scale. Think 5% increase in recoverable reserves, 15% cost savings. This is fundamentally undermining all global efforts in decarbonization. And this was deeply disheartening to me and thousands of employees at the company. One of my partners co-founded the 10,000 employee Green Team, the largest in the world, and their mission is to make sustainability part of everyone's job. And we took this very seriously, which is why we were so distraught when we started to see not only just passive continuing of the contracts, but in the age of generative AI, this started to take off. And so publicly, there's a bold proclamation of the benefits of AI, speculative, and then behind the scenes, behind closed doors, it's being hailed as game-changing to make the future of oil and gas brighter than ever, to reach the wallets of fossil fuel companies in a way that they never had before. And so we did the math. We compared the additional annual emissions from public data of just 2 contracts against Microsoft's entire footprint. And we realized that it was orders of magnitude worse than the entire footprint and was overshadowing any of the good that we were doing inside the company. And this, frankly, it broke my heart. So my partner and I brought together thousands of employees behind us. We compiled our concerns and recommendations, and we went straight to the senior leadership. And it was very constructive and very promising. And the first thing that they did is they agreed to release energy principles, which theoretically put guardrails around how Microsoft works with energy companies. But there are massive loopholes in that so as to make it entirely meaningless and avoid addressing our concerns. And so, again, this is right in the era of generative AI, and suddenly the promises that were made to us remained unfulfilled and even being started to walk back. So we realized that there was a moment where corporate voluntary behavior change would never be enough to mitigate the harms of the technology. And so we were continuing to push, but to be successful, you need to have not only inside pressure, but an outside force. And what was shocking to us is that no one in the world was tackling this issue. And just to be clear, there is no policy today that mitigates the environmental harms resulting from the application of this technology. And that needs to change. So we realized that we needed to be those people. We made a really hard decision. We left a company we loved, thousands of colleagues that we loved working with, and really meaningful jobs to found the Enabled Emissions campaign. We're advocating for policy that aligns the use of technology with climate science. And so this is a call to action to any of you. I ask you to join us in this act of conscious moral rebellion, to really think critically about the harms of the technology and what you're not being told. Because it's just a few of us, and we're fighting some of the most unchecked powers and most powerful powers in the world, big tech and big oil, and they're taking away your future. So please cause some trouble with us.
Go ahead, Zelda.
I'd just like to add to what you're saying is, and we were talking about this earlier. So in 2017, when I broke my NDA with Weinstein, and there was Me Too, and there was this huge public kind of outcry, and for the last now 7 years, I've been speaking, in various different environments, and have been spoken about as the hero in the room. And I've always, really pushed back on that, because I feel that it's really important that people who speak up aren't called heroes and whistleblowers, because actually that makes it more frightening. But what's happened in the last 7 years is I'm almost embarrassed to be sitting here now, because I just spoke up about, a fat sexual predator. We're now in a situation where our world is being taken over by tech billionaires and dictators, and these are the people that we should be speaking about. These are the Me Too moments that we need to be having, which affect the entire world. And, like I say, when I look at what Will is doing, I feel that I'm already like a massive has-been in terms of how much the world has changed in the last 7 years, and where we should look for our enemies, and where we should be looking for, our safety.
And I think it's a good point, Zelda, not just around the changing environment, but also the changing risks to blowing the whistle, right? And that's part of why we put together the panel. Is I think, even 5 years ago, the risks looked very different for whistleblowers. I'm going to come back to you guys and ask you about the term in a short minute, because we were talking earlier. I have individuals, clients who, to this day, will not let me, in public in any way, use the term whistleblower in relation to them. They're happy to be insiders. They're happy to be, employees who raised concerns. The term is incredibly loaded, but it's incredibly loaded because of the risks that come with it. And those risks have changed dramatically, especially for people in tech. You can now be doxxed for speaking out, right? This is federal government level stuff now in the US too. PST is working with federal government workers who are speaking out. The risks aren't just, am I going to lose my job? The risks aren't the psychological impact of blowing the whistle. Maybe both of you can talk about that, but the risks also now are potentially physical. If the guy you're going after has a megaphone that can, in a matter of moments, mobilize hundreds of thousands of people, if they can sue you into bankruptcy, if they can, if you are sitting on compensation packages that are potentially worth not 7 figures anymore, but 8 or 9 figures. And there was a group of OpenAI whistleblowers who came forward last year and said, look, our NDAs are illegal, right? They're stopping us from raising safety concerns. And if those guardrails of protections aren't there, it feels like a much harder moment to be the one speaking up, certainly on your own. And I wonder if both of you, Zelda, you were public, you came forward publicly. Will, you were initially anonymous. Talk a little bit about that and the connotations of being called a whistleblower.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see myself then, and I still don't see myself now as a whistleblower. And, I think that this is part of the issue. I mean, we're going to talk about using that vocabulary and how powerful vocabulary is and terminology is. But I just saw that I was doing something normal. I was doing the right thing. And actually, whistleblowing or speaking up or reporting should be normal. Yeah. And by turning it into a heroic act or a terrifying act, you are chilling, people from coming forward. And for anything to work well, we have to speak up. This is also this does also work for big companies and for organizations and for governments. You need people with integrity to speak up. By removing them and silencing them, that doesn't improve your business model. It might do in the short term, but it doesn't in the long term. I mean, I'm going to pass to you to talk about the terminology, but I mean, using that terminology, I think, is incredibly dangerous. And I also think being told or describing whistleblowers as brave and heroes is also not very helpful. I understand why, but for me, it had nothing to do with bravery. I didn't have a choice. I didn't see it as a choice, and I believe that if you do the right thing, right will win out. And that may be naive, but I think with collective action, that's absolutely right. By individual action, you're taking a huge risk.
I agree, and I think the term whistleblower it's a toxic label, and it takes it redirects the limelight away from those doing the unglamorous collective activism that really causes change.
Yeah.
And then it surfaces this heroic image of an individual. And I also don't identify as a whistleblower. I identify as someone who refused to be made complicit.
Yeah.
And so if you're not exercising your voice and your integrity to your full extent, then you're being forced into a flawed system that's perpetuating greater harms than you could ever imagine. So I think we need to start evolving and really supporting this collective ecology of activism.
Yeah, and part of that is saying no to confidentiality.
Yeah.
If you say no, then you can't be silenced. The moment you sign away your voice, that is when people start to realize that they are complicit. Weirdly, they don't notice it before, but the moment you sign away a human right to speak, then you become complicit in the acts of those that you're not speaking about. And that causes, if you don't want to look at it on the bigger scale, on a personal level, and from the hundreds and, thousands of people that I've now worked with over the last 7 years, the common denominator is that all of the people I've worked with who signed NDAs have had catastrophic effects on their life, their mental health, their physical health, their personal relationships, their ability to ever work again, and certainly not to work generally in their, chosen career or where they spoke up from. And it's no small thing, and there's no fair bargain in money for silence. That money is to not take legal action. It's not for silence.
Yeah, it's hard to envision a future where I stayed silent. I would have just years later eternally regretted it.
Yeah.
There's only now.
But I think it's also, and this is part of what PST is trying to do, which is we are building a safe where people can either get direct pro bono legal advice if you're in the tech sector and just want a gut check on what you're seeing and what your options are. But also, if you're not quite there and you just want to deposit the information and wait and see if someone else is going to raise a similar concern, we'll contact you if someone else raises it so you can collectively act. And it's this point about collective action. And one of the things I noticed in working with you, Will, and some of the others is psychologically the harms that come, and Zelda and I have talked a lot, that the psychological harm of whistleblowing that can sometimes come seemed mitigated when you were working as a collective. You seemed more protected, it was safer, it was less risky for all of you, and while still, challenging, perhaps a bit safer on all fronts, including mentally. And so I guess I'll throw back to the other thing I would say on what you said, Zelda, about the companies. Look, I say this at every compliance thing I talk to. If you're in a company right now and you're worried about your employees, if they wind up with me, you've got an internal compliance problem, right? You've got an internal problem. They shouldn't wind up with me. But to go back, maybe with the last few minutes we've got here, how do we make whistleblowing not whistleblowing? How do we turn it from a heroic act into a culture of just being something we all do, especially in tech where it seems so needed at the moment, of speaking up?
I think we really started out and we figured out a great thing. I mean, there were thousands of employees who were deeply concerned about this, and we brought ourselves together. We put forth our concerns, and there were numerous, years-long opportunities to follow through on basic promises of transparency. The issue is when it was walked back, while the things were headed in the wrong direction. That I think I would have never done what I did alone, and so there's solace in community.
Zelda?
Yeah. Well, I'm just reflecting because when I first was approached by the New York Times, and I told them about my NDA, and I said, I'm really happy to break it. The time is now. I want to break it. But I'd like it if you could maybe bring forward one or two other people, because if there's 2 or 3 of us that come forward, it'll be much harder for Weinstein to come after us. And there wasn't anybody else who was willing to come forward. And when I broke my NDA, I presumed that there'd be this wonderful tsunami of people who would then break their NDA because they saw that the sky didn't fall in. But I think this shows, because that didn't happen. I don't think anybody broke their NDA until after Weinstein was in jail. But what that shows is the enormous fear that these agreements hold over people. And actually, we have to break down that fear. And, it's a very small and simple thing, but saying no to confidentiality, looking at your employment contract before you sign it, looking at your settlement agreement, which I'm not trying to stop anybody from having, but pushing back on confidentiality provisions that are hiding harm or that will take away your voice is unbelievably important. And the more people that do that, the more it'll go away. The reason it's become standard practice is because everybody thinks it's what you have to do. It is not what you have to do. And if you each take that small act, that really will make a difference, because that gives you the power to have the collective voice. And you're absolutely right. The only way to do this, particularly in the environment and the culture that we're currently creeping into, is the only power we're going to have is collectively. And so the collective voice is the most important thing for us right now.
Yeah, and if you lose your voice, then that's all you have.
Yeah, that's it.
So one last question. Would you do it again?
Absolutely. Maybe I would have changed some of the minor tactics or the order of operations, but it's an imperative to have done what I've done and to work the way I have. And since doing it, I found an incredible community outside of the walls of the Golden Citadel, and that has been deeply professionally and personally fulfilling in a way that my other work was not.
Zelda?
Yeah, I would definitely do it again. I haven't found this wonderful community quite. But my life has been completely ruined, but that's fine. I'm the happiest I've ever been. I'm the most fulfilled I've ever been, and I am true to myself. And I have to say that has been a massive life lesson. And my life hasn't really been ruined. But I mean, in terms of what people consider, success, I don't make any money anymore.
That's true of me as well.
It's not the most lucrative profession to follow.
But I can genuinely say I've never grown more, I've never learnt more, I've never met more incredible people with integrity. I've never felt a relationship with being alive in the way that I have, having done this. And I've had lots of wonderful jobs that people told me all my life were enviable. The biggest one being working for Miramax Films and Harvey Weinstein, and look how that turned out. So yeah, I like my little, whatever it is, insider speaking up, whistleblowing world.
Yeah, and once you step through that looking glass, you can't really turn back.
You don't want to either.
On that note, thank you, everyone. I see we're at time.